Mathematics can 100% prove that God exists. That's what we are going to show today. We're also going to look at someone named Michael Egnor, who is a neurosurgeon that used to be an atheist and a materialist, belief that reality was matter and that's it, and that there is no God, who, because of his work as a neurosurgeon and dealing with the brain, particularly split brain work and things like that, now believes that we are all existing in the mind of God, that matter is an illusion and that we exist in the mind of God. That's not the main topic today, but it's going to tie into a little bit. And the reason why that ties into it a little bit is because we're going to kick things off here and start this discussion and show how mathematics proves the existence of God. And you need to see this, but this is going to kick this off by looking at this article on mindmatters.ai called Mathematics Can Prove the Existence of God. And the reason why I brought up Michael Egnor, the neurosurgeon, is because this article is written by that neurosurgeon. Once again, used to be an atheist, used to be a materialist, thought that the world was matter and that's it. As far as I remember, I'm pretty sure those were his stances. And then his work dealing with the brain as a neurosurgeon made him believe that God exists and that we exist in the mind of God, that reality exists in the mind of God. So this is all going to tie together, but you need to see this as we talk about how mathematics can prove and does prove. We're going to show how the existence of God. Now, to start this off, and this is so interesting. The reason I was reading this, I was like, we have to talk about this. So this is let's see. So in a recent post, atheist biologist Jerry Coyne takes issue with a commenter who asserts that God exists in the same way mathematics exists. Here's the analogy the commenter offered. Okay, so we're going to read a comment from someone, and this is super interesting, who believes that God exists in the same way that mathematics exists, as a kind of analogy, right? So, and this is important. Here's the quote by a commenter. Think of numbers, for example, or mathematical equations. These are metaphysical things that have not been created, however, were discovered. And this is very important. Mathematics isn't something that is created by humanity, it is discovered. And that's something that a lot of people have a hard time with. A lot of people misunderstand this, but it's absolutely true. So you take something like the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem has always been true, but humanity discovers it. What humanity creates is not the actual mathematical laws themselves, but rather the particular notation or symbols that we use to represent those laws. That's incredibly important. So just to reiterate, because this is going to be key to showing how mathematics proves God exists, is that mathematics is not something discovered. It's not something invented. It is something discovered. The mathematical laws always exist. What humans invent are the notation, the symbols that are used to represent those laws. So, the particular way we draw a squiggle to represent the number 2, or the equal sign that we have chosen to represent an equality. These are the things that exist, but not the actual laws themselves. Like I said, the Pythagorean theorem, that law was true before it was discovered, and we applied all our notation to it to represent it. So that's important. So the commenter is talking about how numbers and mathematical equations weren't anything that were created. No one created the Pythagorean theorem. It's something that always existed. And if you're like, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? How can math have always existed? I'm going to explain exactly how, but I don't want to get ahead of things so that we can tie this all together. So if you have that question in mind, that's fine. That's good. We are going to answer it. So it says the number 7 was the number 7 before anything at all came into existence. This is also true concerning the nature of God. He is not some material being that has come into existence. He is like a number that's always existed. And by the way, nobody will deny this logic with the number. However, when someone mentions God, a problem occurs. Now, this comment is so interesting because you have here what this commenter is doing is trying to draw an analogy between God and math and numbers by saying God is like mathematics. And then the commenter is explaining mathematics is not something created. It's something that's always existed. And the commenter is saying, well, by drawing an analogy, God is kind of like math. God has also always existed, kind of like math. And then the commenter says, people have no problem with this idea when applied to math, but when you apply it to God, a lot of people have a problem. Well, yes. So the problem is that God, this is not, what's very interesting about this comment is that it shouldn't be an analogy. God isn't like math. God is math. And we're going to show exactly how this is true. So one should have a problem when applied to God if God is something other than math. Because the reason why this analogy is such a good analogy is because God literally is mathematics, understood in a very certain way, understood as, well, we'll get into that. It's must be understood in a certain way. But the problem here is that, and what's so interesting about this article is that they're going to be using mathematics as an analogy for God. But the reason why this analogy works so well is because mathematics represents what God is. And we will explain that, but I want to read some more of this article to kind of have more background. So it says that the commenter, this is now Michael Egnor, the neurosurgeon, continuing, the commenter did not intend to prove God's existence using math. He merely pointed out that God's existence is analogous in limited ways to the existence of numbers. They, like God, are immaterial, real, and eternal, which of course is true. Again, the reason why this is such a good analogy is because mathematics is what represents God, because God and mathematics are one and the same, and is what we are. And this will be explained. Now, it's so interesting to see people get so close. So close and then miss it. They're going, it's so hilarious. It's like, look at this. God, like math, or like math is immaterial, real, and eternal, and they accept this. But and see, this is this Michael Egnor person. I'm not going to get too off track. I just want to make a comment about Michael Egnor because I've been following Michael Egnor's thoughts for a little while now, and he's a very interesting person. He's the one that was an atheist materialist, but then through his work with the brain, became a idealist, belief that reality is mind, not matter. Sometimes he says he's a panpsychist, but lately he's been saying he's an idealist. So it varies, but usually. Anyway, but he went from the idea that reality is material to the idea that reality is mind, which is great. But then went so far to become religious. And the thing is that you don't have to be religious by, at least not in a Christian way. I believe he's Christian. You don't have to believe in the Christian God just because reality is not material. And you don't have to believe in the Christian God just because there is an immaterial, eternal aspect to it. Because that immaterial, eternal aspect to it is us together as God, represented by mathematics. That's what we're going to show today. But it's so interesting to see, because Michael's such an intelligent guy. It's too bad that he goes so far as to think that he has to believe in, say, the Christian God. But let's continue. It says, there is in fact a classical proof of God's existence that uses universal concepts such as mathematics, proposed most prominently by St. Augustine in the 4th century AD. It's sometimes called the Augustinian proof. I find it quite compelling, and it goes like this. Okay, so we're gonna go through this real quick. And remember, we have more to discuss here. I'm just kind of kicking this off here with talking about Michael Egnor. So 2 kinds of things exist in the natural world, particulars and universals. Particulars are material things that we know by our senses, like a rock or a tree or my neighbor Joe, etc. Universals are abstract concepts that we know in the sense that we can contemplate them and talk about them. Geology, botany, humanity, etc. But we cannot know any of these abstractions by our senses alone. We know abstractions by our intellect, which is our capacity for abstract thought. So basically, they're saying that there's two types of things, particulars and universals. Particulars are things that you can touch, sense, hear, and smell, like this particular cup here. A universal, you might say, was like the idea of cup and applies to all cups. But that gets a little confusing and is a little, let's try not to get too confusing about it. Let's just stick to something a little easier. Everything you can touch, taste, see, and smell, you can consider those to be particulars. And remember, I'm summarizing here and being a little more general. You can know particulars by your senses, and you usually when being applied to the material world, they are particular instances of a universal. So they don't necessarily have to be. Okay, hold on. Look. Let's condense this down. Particulars are things that we touch, sense, hear, or smell, usually. Universals are abstract concepts. That's what's important to know. But let's think about it in terms of mathematics, because people, it's easy to explain universals in terms of mathematics. So, and because that's what Egnor continues to say by saying mathematics is an archetype of universals. So what does that mean? Well, think about like the number 2. The number 2 is a universal. The number 2 is and what universal means? It's always true. It's true everywhere, and it will never not be true. For example, if we think of the number 2 is a universal. And the reason why the number 2 is a universal is because it applies to everything that takes part in two-ness. Now, that might sound kind of confusing, but just think about it like this. You never encounter the number 2 in your day-to-day life. You never encounter the number 2 just like floating around. You can encounter 2 things. You can encounter a group of 2 or 3 or 4 things, but you never encounter like 2 itself. So let's continue here. Mathematics is an archetype of universals. Take, for example, the set of natural numbers. It includes all counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, there has been some debate among philosophers and mathematicians about the reality of numbers. That is, do numbers actually exist in a separate Platonic realm, or only in the human mind, or do they have no existence at all? In other words, are they merely words? This is a profound question, but the view that natural numbers and other universals do exist in reality in some fashion is very hard to deny. So the idea here is, does do numbers actually exist in some capacity? Now, there's a lot of very intelligent people who think that that is the case. For example, Gödel was a mathematical Platonist. And that's the idea that mathematics exists separately from us in some way, in some domain. What we're going to see is that mathematics actually is what we are. So technically, mathematical Platonism is not true, because mathematical Platonism, strictly speaking, deems mathematics as existing in a separate realm other than us. But the truth is that mathematics is what we are. We are mathematics. And we're going to show that, that goes along with we are mathematics, mathematics is God, etc. We're going to show how that is the case. Now, but just continuing here, it says, for example, consider the foundation of our solar system. It's formed around one sun, not 2 or 3 or 1,000,000 suns, and it formed before there was any human mind to count the suns. But it is surely just as true that our solar system had one sun 1 billion years ago as it is true now. So the number 1 really exists in some fashion independent of the human mind. The same could be said of any number. Basically what this means is that reality reflects the laws of mathematics. Like when you see a single sun, it doesn't mean that the sun is literally a number 1. It's not literally a number 1. But that sun is obeying the laws of mathematics. And those laws of mathematics are eternal. The point is that everything obeys the laws of mathematics. Not that there are 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s floating around like, oh, there is one sun. It's not meaning that's actually the number one or something like that. It means that all things reflect and adhere to the laws of mathematics. And this is eternally true. It says, for example, we know the ratios of many physical constants of the universe that have existed since the Big Bang. And because these ratios are real, we can measure them, then the numbers the ratios represent are real. So how could numbers exist in reality independent of the human mind? See, that is the problem here. Numbers don't exist independently of the human mind because the human mind is all that exists. Well, not the human mind, but not the human mind, but mind in general is all that exists. And like I said, we're going to dive into this deeper. Reality is mind, which is mathematics. So generally, people who believe in the existence of mathematics as being ontologically real believe that there's the human mind, and then in some other realm exists this domain of mathematical laws. That's not the case. Mathematical laws are us, what we are, and this is reflected through our understanding of the very nature of reality. And what does this have to do with God? Well, we're going to see that it is because we are, in fact, God exploring its own mathematical possibilities. That, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know what existence is, close your ears now. Reality is God exploring its own mathematical possibilities. And that's what we are. We are God exploring itself through its own mathematical possibilities. We are God that has placed ourselves within its own mathematical realm to explore its many different mathematical possibilities and combinations. This is extremely similar to the work of the great philosopher Hegel, who thought that reality was a logical structure exploring itself through itself and through us. And let's continue here. And we'll get into this in more detail. Like I said, it's very important. So anyway, Michael Egnor says, so how could numbers exist in a reality independent of the human mind? Well, we know that reality exists as, mathematics exists as mind. But Plato proposed a realm of forms in which universals exist and which our concepts participate. There are notorious problems with Plato's conception of forms, but it seems undeniable that universals such as numbers do really exist in some sense. The solution proposed by Augustine and many other philosophers and theologians, most notably Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was the inventor of calculus, by the way, is called Scholastic realism. Scholastic realism posits that God's mind is the Platonic realm of forms. Do you see now, Michael Egnor is so close. What Egnor is saying, that by saying that God's mind is the Platonic realm of forms, what is meant by that, in particularly how it's being expressed here, is that God's mind is the realm of mathematical laws. And that's so, it's true, but the only thing that's missing here is that God isn't anything outside or other than these rational relations. And it's not like God is, the God of the Bible who also has math as part of its mind. No, it's that is what God is, and also that is what we are, because we are God, expressed through itself, exploring its own mathematical possibilities and combinations. So, Augustine proposed that universals such as numbers, mathematics in general, propositions, logic, necessities, and possibilities exist in the divine intellect, which is infinite and real and eternal. This is right. So Augustine proposed that universals like numbers, mathematics, propositions, logic, necessities, and possibilities exist in the divine intellect, which is infinite and eternal. This is true. The only thing that one has to remember is that we are that divine intellect. And one can understand this really easily, too, in a certain way, because if you think about the idea that God is infinite, if we weren't God, then we would be something other than God. And if we were something other than God, then God would be limited and not infinite, because there would be something other than God. There would be something that was not God. If there was something not God, God would not be infinite. And so what's really interesting is that people who say that God exists and is infinite, yet deny that we are God, or at least an expression and part of God, people who deny that don't understand that they're making a logical problem, a logical error here. Because if God is infinite, then there can be nothing that limits God, meaning there can be nothing other than God. So that's really important to understand. I believe that was pointed out as well by Ken Folless. So Michael's continuing here. What's remarkable about the reality of universals as proof of God's existence is that it points in a simple and clear way to some of God's attributes, such as infinity, eternity, and omnipotence. To see how, consider again the set of natural numbers, which is infinite. It's so interesting that to make this analogy to all these different attributes of God, it keeps going to mathematics as a powerful analogy. But the reason why it's a powerful analogy is because that is what we /God/reality is. Mathematics as an expression of reason, which is what we're gonna get to this. We're gonna break this down. So it says the mind. See, this is interesting. It's saying consider the set of natural numbers. The mind that contains them must be infinite, because the mind in which natural numbers exists is infinite. It is also omnipotent. Limitations on power are finite and inconsistent within an infinite mind. Because numbers exist independently of the material universe, they are eternal. The truth that 1 + 1 = 2 is independent of time, and thus the mind that contains them is eternal. Basically saying that 1 + 1 = 2 is always true. It wasn't true yesterday. It was true yesterday, but it didn't just become true yesterday. It didn't just become true 3 days ago. It didn't just become true 1 billion years ago. It's always been true and always will be true. There's never a time when 1 + 1 won't equal 2. And so Egnor continues, I find the Augustinian proof of God's existence via reality of universals in the divine mind a compelling proof. It is a highly satisfying and even beautiful concept. Our abstract thoughts have a real existence in the mind of our Creator, and we who are created in his image participate in his thoughts. You see, so Michael is so close, but he goes so far to use this idea of something that God is somehow other than us. God is not other than us. God is what we are. Like, hello, hi, like I am God, you are God. We placed ourselves in here to experience our own work. Like, what do you think if God was some separate being, all right, why the hell would he just or they, whatever, just be up there staring down at what we're doing? Why does God care? Why would God give a shit? Why? If God is all-knowing and all-powerful and infinite, why is he going to make a bunch of creatures like us mill around and kill each other? For fun? Well, God is all-knowing and all-powerful, so if God already knows everything, God doesn't need to actually do it because he would know what would happen. He wouldn't actually, or they wouldn't actually do it. I'm saying he because at this point I'm thinking of the monotheistic Christian God. That's what I'm envisioning, the Abrahamic father, patriarchal, typical God. So I'll continue to use he when I'm referring to that unfortunate idea of God. This God, if he was all-knowing, would not do these things because God already knew what would happen. It would be kind of remember, God is infinite, eternal, and omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere. So it would be kind of if you read the same book an infinite number of times, you wouldn't read that book again. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's kind of like that. If you read a book infinite number of times, you wouldn't read it again. It's kind of sort of like that. If God is all-knowing, God wouldn't create this because God knows exactly what would happen, and there would be no, it would be boring as fuck. So, anyway. Oh, but my point there being, I got a little off track, was that what God does do is shatters itself, thus effectively doing like a memory wipe of God. And in this shattering of God's self, which is the Big Bang, eventually through evolution, bodies evolve and all that, God begins to experience itself within its own creation, which was formed by its own shattering. Do you see here? God is us, but all-knowing. The only way to experience something interesting is to shatter and have a memory wipe so that you forget what you are. So God forgot what it was to place itself into its own creation, to have the experience of life through us. Like once this stuff starts to click, it's almost obvious. Like what else? Like put yourself in God's position. What else could you possibly do? It would be so boring. That's the only thing that you could do. That's the only thing that you could do, was shatter yourself, do a memory wipe, and place yourself in this existence to experience your creation through yourself from the perspective of not knowing. Now, of course, we have the joy of returning to knowledge of that, and that's okay, because we're gathering that knowledge and using that knowledge to create a better experience for ourselves. But once this stuff really clicks, it's like, oh, right, of course that's what this is. There's nothing else one could do. So, okay, so it says, so while the analogy drawn by the commenter between God and mathematics does not in itself demonstrate God's existence, as the commenter acknowledges, the very existence of mathematics and other abstract concepts points in a quite direct way to an infinite, omnipotent, and eternal divine intellect. Thus, mathematics itself is a proof of God's existence. As I have observed elsewhere, God is everywhere if you know how to look for him. Now, you see, and we're gonna break all this down, jump into it, and dive into it a lot more, and show how mathematics shows that God exists. But isn't it so interesting how it's like, wow, look at this. This analogy is so good. The reason why it's so good is because that is our essence as God, as a mathematical set of as a living mathematical system. This is exploring its own possibilities. Now, Pythagoras knew this. They talked about Plato, and the domain of forms and all that. But Pythagoras said that all is number and that number rules the universe. And Pythagoras learned a lot from the mystery schools of Egypt. So it comes from Egypt. And this understanding that reality is mathematical. So let's dive into this, break it down real quick, and show why it seems like such a good analogy. Well, here's the thing. We have to understand what really mathematics is. To get deeper than this, we have to talk more abstractly, even though mathematics is abstract. What is true is actually reason. This is a rational reality. This is a reality of reason, and mathematics is an expression of reason. Now, this is important to understand. Now, we can, if you want, I'm going to do a very quick dive into this. If you want to know the full story of what I'm going to talk about, watch my video called The Most Important Philosophical Question of All Time, Solved, I think. Something like that. But anyway, here's the idea that we're saying, this is what's going on, that reason is what is eternally true, and mathematics is an expression of reason. Now, a very particular kind of mathematics, a living mathematics, a mathematics as understood. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but let's just talk about this. So reason is what is true. Why? Why is that the case? Because if reason didn't exist, then the impossible would exist. And what I mean by that is that reason, the existence of reason is mandatory. Because if you think about reality, everything behaves according to laws. I think everyone can agree with that. If I say that everything obeys according to reason, I think that people have a hard time with that because they don't really understand what reason is. They think, what do you mean? Like people behave irrationally all the time. That's not what it really means. It, in a nutshell, means that everything obeys laws. Everything obeys laws. Now, these laws ultimately are reason. These rational laws have to exist. The reason why that these rational laws have to exist is because if these rational laws didn't exist, then the impossible would exist. Things that, and again, it's one of those things where when it might sound complicated at first, but when you really understand it, it all clicks. Just like, oh yeah, right, that's the only thing God could do. When you understand why reason must exist, rational law must exist, it's like, oh yeah, of course it does. And to put it in a nutshell, it's because that which doesn't exist, non-existence, can't exist. Like the impossible can't exist. Obviously can't. It's impossible. And existence must exist because it can't not exist. The reason why existence must exist because it can't not exist is because existence is reason. And reason must exist logically because if it didn't, then the impossible would exist, and that's impossible. If that sounds confusing, it's actually very, very simple. But it's because we're dealing with the very boundary of thought, the very edges of thought. That's why it might sound difficult at first, but once it clicks, it's one of the simplest things in the world. So if you want to know precisely 100% what I'm talking about, again, watch my video called The Most Important Philosophical Question of All Time. I think solved or answered or something like this. And it has to do why we must exist. But in a nutshell, this is why. Because reason has to exist. If reason didn't exist, the impossible would exist. It's kind of like saying if there were no laws, then there would be nothing to prevent just absolute absurdity and insanity. But absolute absurdity and insanity literally can't exist. It's impossible. So basically here we have reason as having to exist. And what this means is that since reason has to exist, is that, and again, if you don't really know why that is, watch the video I just mentioned, because that video is quite a long video. I don't have enough time to insert that into right here, but but that part is necessary to understand the next point. So watch that video. But because reason exists, mathematics exists. The reason why mathematics exists is because mathematics is simply the set of all valid and compatible rational relations. So it's a set of all valid and compatible rational relations, or you might say compossible rational relations, just meaning it's the set of all laws. What that means is mathematics is the set of all laws that are valid and don't conflict with each other. That's basically what that means. That reality in general is the set of all things that are possible to be and that don't contradict or conflict with each other. You can think of it like the perfect computer code. It's a set of laws where there's no errors or bugs or anything like that, and they all work together. Now, another thing that I don't entirely have time to get into right now, but I've done so in other videos, is that mathematics expresses itself as frequency. And because frequency is ultimately a mathematical concept. Frequency is just the number of times of oscillation in a unit of measurement. And so the frequency is just an expression of mathematics. So here we have basically reason has to exist, it must exist. Mathematics is just an expression of reason, and frequency is just an expression of mathematics. And ultimately, this is all that exists because we can use these laws to construct all reality. What I mean by that is that mathematics has all the properties of God in common because mathematics is God. It's eternal, it's necessary, and it's just like a computer code can create a video game world. Mathematics has the power to create the entirety of the world around us. And so God, as mathematics, which is an expression of reason, which expresses itself via frequency, uses itself to generate the material world. And then we are the expressions of God. We're not something separate from God. God isn't different than us. We are God having the pleasure and experience of experiencing itself through itself. God is watching Netflix through us. Like that's what reality is, basically Netflix for God. God just shattered itself to have this experience through itself. Imagine if you watched the same Netflix show an infinite number of times. It would be boring as fuck. But if you forgot the show, you could watch it again. And so this is not the perfect analogy, but you get the idea. Is that the shattering of the mind of God as a mathematical mind is the only thing that God could do in an existence where God must exist. God has to exist because it is literally existence. God isn't anything other than existence. If there was something other than God, there would be something other than existence, and then God would not be infinite. There would be something that limited God. God, us, we are unlimited. The only way that we can be quote unquote limited, which is a pseudo limitation, is through the limiting of ourselves. But that is a pseudo limitation, not a true limitation. It's kind of like a Rubik's Cube that solves itself and then mixes itself up again. It's not really a limitation of the cube. It's a different permutation of the cube, a different form of the cube. So God isn't necessarily limiting itself, but rather putting itself into a different form. And this form we experience through ourselves. Now, you could say this is a limiting factor of God, but if so, it's only through itself from the perspective of ourselves. So the reason why that mathematics shows that God exists is because mathematics is God. Now, this is what's super important to know about this, though, is that because mathematics shows that God exists, doesn't mean that it shows that the God of the Bible exists. And this is a thing that people have such a hard time with, because there are some very, very interesting rational arguments for the existence of God. But these arguments don't prove that it doesn't prove that a God in the sky created the earth in a week and sent his son to die on a cross for you. It doesn't prove any of that. It just shows that reality needs something that is necessary, infinite, and eternal, which are rational laws through which mathematics expresses itself, which is expressed via frequency. And this is all we need to generate all reality, just like a computer code is all we need to generate a video game world. Mathematics is all we need to generate the physical world. So, really important, if you want to understand this well, if you really want to understand, if some parts of this didn't seem clear, check out the video, the answer to the greatest philosophical question of all time. That's what it's called. The answer to the greatest philosophical question of all time. Hey, I'll even link it up here. Why not? And also, I've done other videos as well that go into more detail about how it shows that we are that mind. And that is critical as well. So, hey, guess what? If you like my content, hit the like, hit the subscribe button. It helps out a lot, helps the channel, helps spread information like this. And this is information that really needs to get out there because it'll solve a lot of problems when we realize that we're just expressions of ourselves, through ourselves, getting to know ourselves. Then guess what? We don't have to hate and kill each other anymore. We can express our diversity and enjoy our diversity, because that's the whole point of life, is to experience our diversity. That's the point. So if you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon. It really helps, and you get access to secret videos, secret live streams, our hidden Discord server, the Citadel. Our last secret video was Is the Heart and Brain Quantumly Entangled? This is really good stuff. So consider supporting there. I want to shout out to everyone who does support, especially philanthropists, Zach, Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Michael, Angela, Maria, Top of the World, Ethan, DB, and Joel. Another way you can support is by hitting the join button on YouTube right below this video.